All right, let's dive into one of the biggest mysteries in American history, the assassination of JFK.
It's one of those events, just continues to spark debate and all those conspiracy theories even now.
Yeah, exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be using an article called Lee Harvey Oswald, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Logic of Conspiracy from the Kennedy Assassination Chronicles journal.
Really gets to the heart of it. Did Oswald act alone? Did this former Marine with a pretty strange past, was he really the only one involved on that day in Dallas?
That's the question everyone wants answered.
Yeah.
We'll also be looking at some excerpts from a New York Times article. It's about JFK's medical history, which they kept hidden from the public.
Definitely interesting, especially when you think about all the speculation about his health and how it might have played a role that day.
So let's start with Lee Harvey Oswald. What do our sources say about him?
Well, they paint a picture of a guy who was really troubled and complex. His childhood was unstable, lots of moving around, not a great relationship with his mother. He seemed to be looking for something, some kind of ideology or cause he could believe in. That's what led him to Marxism, I think.
And that's eventually what led him to defect to the Soviet Union, right?
Right. Yeah. It's like he was always pushing boundaries, going against the world. But there's a pattern here. Almost every time Oswald failed or faced a setback, he would do something dramatic, almost like he wanted attention, recognition.
Like what?
Well, like when he was in the Marines and he got in trouble, he defected. When he couldn't get into the Soviet Union at first, he tried to kill himself. And then later, he got fired from a job he liked, and then tried to assassinate General Walker.
Wow, that's pretty extreme.
Hmm.
So are you saying that the assassination, of President Kennedy was just another one of these acts?
Well, it's something to consider. His life wasn't good at the time. He was trying to get back with his wife, and he had just been denied entry into Cuba. Maybe this was his way of making a statement, a tragic final attempt to be someone important.
Okay, that's an interesting psychological perspective. But what about the actual evidence against him?
Well, there's the rifle they found at the book depository, the bullet casings, his fingerprints, even photographs of him with the rifle.
This seems like pretty solid evidence.
Yeah, it does. But there are things that don't add up. Oswald said those photographs were fake. And then, of course, he was killed by Jack Ruby before they could even have a trial. So he never had the chance to defend himself.
So no day in court for Oswald. And that's why all the conspiracy theories started, right? Because there were so many unanswered questions.
Exactly. The fact that Oswald couldn't tell his side of the story and the fact that there was all this secrecy surrounding the assassination, it just made people wonder, what really happened.
This article we're looking at, it talks about the logic of conspiracy. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it's like applying the scientific method, but to events that are full of secrets and lies, like trying to put together a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing. But even with those missing pieces, you can still look for patterns and try to make sense of it.
So you're saying even the most complicated conspiracies have a logic to them, and we can figure it out by looking for patterns in the information we do have.
Yeah, that's the idea. And in the case of JFK, there are some pretty interesting patterns, especially when you look at the CIA and organized crime.
Okay, let's start with the CIA. They're known for covert operations, and, well, let's face it, they haven't exactly been honest in the past.
That's one way to put it. Think about the Guatemalan coup in 54, the U-2 incident in 60, or the Bay of Pigs in 61. The CIA has been involved in shaping global events through these covert operations, and they haven't always played by the rules.
And a lot of those incidents involved manipulating the truth, right? Even outright lying. But what about illegal activities? Was the CIA involved in any of that?
Unfortunately, yes. There's actually documented evidence of them trying to assassinate foreign leaders, like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. They had these domestic surveillance programs like Project Minaret, and even used American citizens in experiments with LSD and other dangerous substances.
That's pretty scary stuff. So are we saying the CIA could have been involved in JFK's assassination, or at least tried to cover it up?
Well, it's not something we can just ignore. They had the means and possibly even a motive, especially after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Kennedy wasn't happy with the CIA and was thinking about making some major changes to the agency.
All right, so the CIA is definitely a player in this whole conspiracy theory, but what about organized crime? How do they fit into all of this?
Well, the mafia has a long history of violence and political influence. They weren't afraid to get rid of anyone who threatened their interests, and they definitely had reasons to want Kennedy out of the picture.
You're talking about the Kennedy administration's crackdown on organized crime, right?
Yeah.
with Robert Kennedy going after the mob.
Exactly. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, was really tough on organized crime. He went after people like Carlos Marcello, even deported him in 1961. And there were rumors that the Kennedys had made some powerful enemies in the underworld, like Sam Giancana and Sandro Trafficante Jr.
Didn't the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, conclude that organized crime was probably behind both JFK and MLK's assassinations?
Yeah, they did. After years of investigating, they found a lot of evidence that pointed to figures like Carlos Marcello and Sandro Trafficante Jr. as the ones who orchestrated the assassination. They even said it was probably a conspiracy involving a bunch of people.
So we've got the CIA, organized crime, both with their own reasons and the capability to take out Kennedy. But where does Lee Harvey Oswald fit into all of this? I'm not seeing the connection.
That's where things get really interesting. We need to look at Oswald's connections. The people he knew, some with ties to intelligence, some to the underworld. It's a complicated web.
Okay, let's untangle this web then. I'm ready to dive in. Okay, let's untangle this web then. Where do we even begin with all these connections? Who are we talking about here?
Well, there's David Ferry, for one. He was Oswald's Civil Air Patrol instructor, back in the day.
Okay, what's so suspicious about a former instructor?
Ferry was a pretty strange guy. He had these ties to intelligence agencies, but also to the Marcello crime family, the same one we were talking about earlier. And get this, he was a pilot too, known to hang out with anti-Castro Cubans.
Wow, that's a whole lot of intrigue wrapped up in one person. What about Oswald's family? Did any of them have these kind of connections?
Actually, yeah, his uncle, Charles Dutz Murrett, he was a bookie for the Marcello crime family. So, Oswald was definitely exposed to that world way before the assassination.
So these links to organized crime go way back. It's starting to feel like Oswald was right in the middle of something really shady.
Right, exactly. And then there's this whole theory about Oswald being part of a phony defector program, run by the Office of Naval Intelligence.
A phony defector? What's that?
Well, the idea is that they would send these guys with military experience to the Soviet Union to pretend to defect, but really they were gathering intelligence.
So you're saying Oswald's defection could have been a setup?
It's a possibility. Then you've got this guy, Yuri Nosenko, a Soviet defector.
Okay.
And he made some claims about Oswald's time in the Soviet Union, but those claims just raised more questions. Some people even think Nosenko was a disinformation agent sent by the Soviets to throw everyone off.
So we're talking about Oswald possibly being a double agent, maybe even a triple agent, working for the U.S., the Soviets, A&D, the mafia.
Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but all these connections are there. And don't forget, the CIA and FBI, they were watching Oswald after he came back to the U.S. They definitely knew something about him.
Yeah, that's strange. Why were they keeping tabs on him if he was just some disgruntled ex-Marine?
Good question. Maybe they thought he was dangerous, or maybe they were using him for something. We just don't know. And then there's Guy Bannister, former FBI agent, super anti-Castro. Remember that address on Oswald's leaflets?
The one that pointed to Bannister's office?
Yeah, exactly. What was that all about? It's just one of those things that makes you think, something's not right here.
Right.
Oh, and then there's David Atlee Phillips, a big shot in the CIA.
Yeah.
There are people who say they saw him with Oswald multiple times. And Phillips, he was involved in the Bay of Pigs and some operations in Mexico City, which is where Oswald went right before the assassination.
Oh, wasn't Oswald trying to get a visa to Cuba just before Kennedy was killed?
Yeah, he was. And apparently Phillips was seen with him at the Cuban consulate in Mexico City using a fake name, Maurice Bishop. Plus, there are rumors Oswald was talking to a Soviet agent there, too. It gets pretty complicated.
It's like every time we turn over a rock, we find more connections to intelligence agencies.
Right. And then there's this other guy, George de Mohrenschildt, a rich oil guy, but with intelligence connections. He became friends with Oswald after he came back from the Soviet Union. Some people think he was like Oswald's handler, manipulating him.
So we've got all these links between Oswald and intelligence agencies, the mafia. It's all circumstantial, but it's still pretty suspicious, right? Does any of this actually mean there was a conspiracy?
I mean, it's hard to ignore, right? It definitely raises a lot of questions about what Oswald's role really was. Was he just this lone wolf who went crazy? Was he set up to take the fall? Or was he a part of a bigger plan?
Okay, I got to ask about those people who said they knew something was going to happen. The ones who predicted the assassination. Those stories are always so creepy.
Yeah, those are definitely some of the most chilling details.
So who are we talking about? Give me the details.
There's this guy, William Somerset, he was a police informant in Miami.
Hmm.
And he had this recording of a guy named Joseph Miltier, some kind of right-wing extremist. And in the recording, Miltier talks about a plan to assassinate Kennedy. He even says they're going to use a high-powered rifle and shoot him from a tall building.
That's terrifying. And he said this before the assassination.
Yeah, a couple of weeks before.
Yeah.
And here's the really creepy part. He also said that they were going to find some innocent guy and pin it on him, like a patsy.
That's wild. It's like he knew exactly what was going to happen.
Right. And then there's Carlos Marcello, remember him? The New Orleans mob boss with all the connections to Oswald. Well, someone overheard him talk about plans to kill Kennedy, too.
So both Miltier and Marcello, two guys with links to Oswald, were talking about killing Kennedy before it happened. This is getting really unsettling.
Yeah, it is. And then there's this woman, Sylvia Odio. She was a Cuban exile. Her family had to flee Cuba after Castro took over.
Right.
And she said that Oswald visited her apartment in Dallas about 2 months before the assassination. He was with 2 other Cubans pretending to be part of this anti-Castro group, JURE.
So Oswald was meeting with Cuban exiles just weeks before Kennedy was shot. What happened at that meeting?
Well, Odio said that later on, one of the Cubans called her and said that Oswald had been talking about killing Kennedy. He was even bragging about how good of a shot he was. Odio thought it was really strange and reported it to the FBI.
Wow. So maybe Oswald was dropping hints about his plans all along.
It's possible. And there's one more thing. 5 days before the assassination, the FBI sent out a memo. It said there might be an attempt on Kennedy's life in Dallas.
Hold on. The FBI knew about a possible threat in advance.
That's what the memo says. They even mentioned some militant group as the possible culprit. Some people think that Oswald, might have been an FBI informant at the time, and he might have been the one who told them.
That just adds another layer to this whole mystery. So we've got these predictions, suspicious connections, and even an FBI warning, all pointing toward a conspiracy. But what about the physical evidence, the stuff from the crime scene? Does any of it support the idea of a conspiracy?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's a question that has fueled countless debates and investigations over the years. The physical evidence itself is a puzzle, full of conflicting interpretations and unanswered questions.
Yeah, the physical evidence, it all comes down to that in the end, right? I mean, does any of it actually support the idea of a conspiracy?
That's where things get really messy. I mean, you've got eyewitnesses saying all kinds of things. Some saying the shots came from the book depository. Some saying the grassy knoll. It's all over the place.
It's like everyone saw something different that day. Nobody can agree.
Yeah, and when you start looking at the forensic evidence, it gets even more complicated. Some people say the autopsy records and photos, they were messed with, like someone was trying to hide something about Kennedy's wounds, the direction of the bullets.
Tampering with evidence, that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. But there are other explanations too, Maybe the inconsistencies are just because it was such a chaotic scene and the technology back then wasn't as good as it is now. Plus, the medical examiners were under a lot of pressure to finish the autopsy quickly.
I guess in a situation like that, mistakes could happen, right? But it's still, I don't know, it makes you wonder if we can really trust the evidence.
For sure. And speaking of evidence that makes you wonder, there's this recording, a police dictaphone recording, that caught the sounds of the assassination. It's really fueled the conspiracy theories.
I've never heard of this recording before. What is it?
So back in the 70s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, the same one that said organized crime was probably involved, they analyzed this recording. And guess what they found? They said there was a 4th shot, and it probably came from the grassy knoll.
A 4th shot?
Yeah.
But Oswald only fired 3 times, right?
Yeah.
From the book depository.
Exactly. So if there was a 4th shot, that means there had to be another shooter, right? And that blows the lone gunman theory out of the water.
Did anyone else confirm that finding about the 4th shot?
Well, there was this group from the National Academy of Sciences, and they said, no, the sounds on the recording were just static, background noise, that kind of thing. But then in 2001, a scientist named Donald Thomas did a whole new study with better technology, and he published his findings in a scientific journal.
And what did his study say?
He said that the HSCA was probably right, that there was a good chance, more than 96%, that a shot came from the grassy knoll. So basically, he's backing up the idea of a second gunman.
So we've got scientific evidence that supports a conspiracy.
Yeah, it definitely adds to it. But even with all this, people still argue about it. Some say Thomas's study was flawed. Others say, well, even if there was a 4th shot, that doesn't automatically mean it was a conspiracy.
Man, this is so confusing. Okay, so we've talked about Oswald's life, the CIA, the mafia, the predictions, the audio recording. I mean, it's a lot to take in. What are we supposed to think? Who killed JFK?
Honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer. There's evidence that points to Oswald, but there's also evidence that makes you think maybe he was just a pawn in a much bigger game. And then you've got these powerful groups, the CIA, the mafia, their connections to Oswald. It all raises a lot of questions.
It's like we've been looking into this dark part of history, and we still can't really see what's there. It's
Yeah,
frustrating.
I know what you mean. And maybe the worst part is we might never know the whole truth, but I think that's why it's so important to keep asking questions, keep challenging the official story. Don't just accept what they tell you.
So what do we do with all this information? How do we even begin to make sense of it?
Well, I think the most important thing is to keep digging, to keep an open mind, and to form your own conclusions based on what you find. The truth is out there somewhere, but it's not always easy to find, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as the JFK assassination.
This has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's one of those historical events that makes you question everything you thought you knew.
And that's a good thing, because the JFK assassination, it really makes us confront these uncomfortable truths about power and secrecy. It shows us that even in a democracy, finding the truth can be really hard.
Well, to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. If you're interested in this topic, we encourage you to keep researching, keep asking those questions, and make up your own mind about what happened. The mystery might never be fully solved, but the search for answers is just as important.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe someday some new piece of evidence will come out and finally shed some light on this dark chapter in American history. But until then, we'll just have to keep searching for the truth.